He tried to seize the blade mid-air. It stopped a millimeter from his fingers. Part 1. The Ambassador's Gambit. The station Ironhold was not a beautiful place. It was built to be strong, not pretty. Its walls were thick gray metal. Its corridors were wide enough for cargo loaders and armored suits. Its lights were cold and white. It sat at the edge of human-controlled space like a clenched fist, quiet, still, and ready. Today, it was hosting guests. The Veldrath Dominion had sent their supreme envoy, a creature named Cress, to negotiate the border rights of a disputed zone that both humanity and the Dominion had been eyeing for years. The zone had minerals. It had jump points. It had strategic value that both sides understood very well. And so the meeting had been arranged, formal, official, and watched by 12 other species across the galaxy through encrypted feeds. Everyone expected humanity to fold. That was not an unfair expectation. The Veldrath Dominion was old. They had existed as an interstellar power for over 4,000 years. They had absorbed 17 civilizations into their territory, not through war alone, but through the slow, suffocating weight of their presence. They did not always use weapons. Sometimes they simply arrived, stood in a room, and let the silence do the work. Cress was very good at silence. He entered the negotiation chamber on Ironhold with 6 of his aides, all of them tall and scaled and moving with the kind of slow, deliberate confidence that came from never having been told no. Their skin was dark green and gray. Their eyes were wide and yellow, and they wore long ceremonial coats that swept the floor as they walked. Cress himself stood nearly 3 meters tall. He wore no armor. He did not need to. His size was armor enough. Waiting on the other side of the long black table was Jay. Jay was not an impressive-looking man at first glance. He was average height, lean, with short black hair and a clean-pressed dark suit. He was 38 years old. He had spent the last 12 years of his career in deep space diplomatic assignments, border disputes, trade negotiations, ceasefire talks. He had sat across from angry warlords, desperate colony governors, and alien representatives who thought very little of humans. He had learned one thing from all of it. The person who reacts first loses. He stood as Cress entered, not out of submission, but simply because it was polite. He gave a small nod. He did not smile. He gestured toward the seats on the other side of the table, and said, calmly, "Welcome to Ironhold, Envoy Cress. Please sit." Cress looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat. The other human in the room was Hyun. He stood near the main door, straight-backed, hands behind him, eyes forward. He was the station's security liaison for the meeting, assigned to the chamber in case anything went wrong. He was 29, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of face that gave nothing away. He had been briefed on the Veldrath before the meeting. He had read everything available. He had then asked one question to his commanding officer. "What do we do if they escalate?" His officer had told him to use his judgment. That was not a comforting answer, but Hyun had accepted it. He had been in the military long enough to know that use your judgment usually meant, we trust you, and also we cannot be held responsible. The negotiation began normally enough. Documents were placed on the table. A translator ran quietly between both sides. Cress made his opening position clear. The disputed zone belonged to the Dominion by right of prior exploration, and humanity was to withdraw all survey teams and outposts within 60 days. In exchange, the Dominion would allow human trade vessels to pass through 3 of their outer corridors at reduced tariff. It was not an offer. It was dressed like one, but it was not. Jay listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He let Cress finish completely. Then he picked up his own document, set it flat on the table, and said, "Thank you for that position, Envoy. Here is ours." He laid out humanity's counter, joint administration of the zone, Shared extraction rights split at 60-40 in humanity's favor, given their earlier established outposts, and full navigation rights through the zone for both parties. His tone was the same as if he were describing the weather. Flat, clear, unhurried. Cress stared at him. One of them leaned toward Cress and said something in Veldrath that the translator did not catch entirely, but the tone was clear. Something close to disbelief. Cress said nothing for a moment. Then he reached down to the long ceremonial blade hanging at his side, a war blade, solid black, nearly a meter long, with a handle carved from the bone of something old and large, and he lifted it from its sheath. Not fast, slowly, letting everyone in the room see it. He held it up for a moment, and then he brought it down hard onto the center of the negotiation table. The table split. The crack was loud in the quiet room. Documents scattered. A water glass fell and shattered on the floor. Two of Jay's junior aides flinched back from their seats. The translator stuttered. One of the external feeds watching the meeting cut out briefly from the impact vibration. Cress left the blade standing in the split table and leaned forward. His yellow eyes were on Jay. He spoke, and the translator caught it this time. You do not have the position to make counteroffers. You have the position of a species that has existed for less time than our empire's youngest province. You will take the terms given, or the next conversation will not be at a table. The room was very still. Everyone waited to see what Jay would do. Jay looked at the blade in the table. He looked at the split wood. He looked at the scattered papers. Then he looked back up at Cress. He straightened his tie. That table, he said quietly, was imported from Earth. Oak, about 200 years old. I will have to file a damage report. He picked up one of the scattered documents from the floor, smoothed it flat on what remained of the table in front of him, and looked back at Cress with the same calm face he had walked in with. Shall we continue? Cress did not respond immediately. Somewhere behind the camera feeds, 12 alien species watched the moment, and did not know what to make of it. Neither did Cress. That was the problem, and Jay knew it. He had dealt with enough Veldrath history to understand one thing about them. They were built for dominance, but they were not built for confusion. A species that had never been told no, had also never learned how to read a room that wasn't afraid of them. And right now, Jay was not afraid of them. That alone was enough to make Cress uncertain. And an uncertain Cress was a dangerous one, the kind that stopped calculating and started reacting. Hyun, standing near the door, felt it before it happened. The shift in the room. The way Cress's aides pulled back slightly. The way Cress's hand moved back toward the blade in the table. Hyun's eyes moved to the blade. He kept his face still. He tried to seize the blade mid-air. It stopped a millimeter from his fingers. Part 2. The Blade Flies. The next hour was the longest Hyun had ever spent standing still. Cress had pulled the blade back out of the table after Jay's quiet response, and set it on the surface in front of him. Not in its sheath, just flat on the table, within reach. It was a message. Not a subtle one. The blade was there to remind everyone in the room that the conversation could end in more than one way. Jay ignored it. He continued talking. He laid out numbers, survey data, resource projections. He spoke about the 6 outposts humanity had already built in the disputed zone. Not aggressively, just factually, the way someone talks about things that already exist and are not going away. He referenced old treaties, border agreements, the Galactic Navigation Accords of 2281. He was unhurried and precise. And every time Cress tried to talk over him or cut him off, Jay would simply pause, wait for the interruption to finish, and then continue from exactly where he had stopped. It was, in its own way, one of the most controlled things Hyun had ever watched. Cress was getting frustrated. That much was obvious. even across a species barrier. His jaw tightened. His wide yellow eyes had stopped blinking at their usual slow pace, and were now fixed and sharp. His aides kept exchanging glances that the translator program wasn't built to read, but that Hyun had no trouble understanding. They were watching their superior lose his footing in a conversation he had expected to last 20 minutes. It had now been over an hour, and the human across from Kress had not moved from his original position by a single point. At some stage, one of Kress's aides passed him a note. Kress read it. He looked up at Jay. Then he asked, in a tone that had dropped several degrees in warmth, whether humanity understood what the Veldrath Dominion had done to the last species that refused to come to terms in a boundary negotiation. Jay said he did. He had read the history. And, Kress said, and I think the Orvani made the mistake of believing that the threat was the point, Jay said. The threat was not the point. The terms were the point. They refused the terms and lost everything. We are not refusing your terms because we cannot read a threat, envoy. We are offering different terms because ours are better. For both parties, there is a difference. Kress stared at him. Then he looked at the blade on the table. Hyun saw it. The decision moving behind Kress's eyes. The calculation, or rather, the collapse of calculation into something simpler and more dangerous. Kress was not thinking anymore. 4,000 years of unquestioned authority had hit a wall, and the wall had a calm face and a slightly loosened tie, and something in Kress had broken past the point of diplomacy. Kress picked up the blade. Jay's junior aides scrambled back from the table. The translator program made a noise, not words, just a feedback burst from the sudden movement. One of the external feeds cut completely. Two of Kress's own aides stood up from their seats, though whether to help or to stop him, it was not clear. Kress did not throw the blade at Jay. He turned. He looked directly at Hyun. The choice made a kind of cold sense. Hyun realized in the fraction of a second he had to think about it. Kress was not trying to win the negotiation anymore. He was trying to change it, to end the conversation about terms and start a different one. About power, about what humans would do when a member of their own was threatened. Or he wanted to see aggression. Either one would give him something to work with. A frightened human would fold. An aggressive one would give the Dominion a justification for escalation. Either way, Kress won. That was the calculation. It was fast, and it was brutal, and it was the kind of move that 4,000 years of dominance teaches a species to make without thinking. Kress threw the blade. It was not a slow throw. It came hard and fast and spinning across the width of the chamber. Not wildly, but aimed. Aimed directly at Hyun, standing at the door 20 meters away. The blade caught the cold white light of the room as it turned in the air. It was heavy and it was real, and it was moving at a speed that gave almost no time for anything. A sound went through the room. Not a scream, more like a sharp collective inhale. One of Jay's aides made a noise and dropped behind the table. The translator program went completely silent. Kress stood, with his arms still extended from the throw. Yellow eyes fixed on the human at the door, waiting. Hyun did not step aside. He did not drop. He did not raise his arms to shield himself. He did not run. He raised his right hand. Not in defense, not like someone throwing their arm up to block. It was deliberate. It was controlled. His arm came up, and his hand extended, palm inward, fingers open, reaching forward into the path of the blade, like he was trying to catch something thrown gently across a room. The blade spun toward him. The room watched. Kress watched. And then something happened that made every alien representative on every external feed lean forward in their seats. The blade slowed. Not a little, not from air resistance or distance. It slowed the way something slows when something else is pulling at it. And then it stopped. It hung in the air across the chamber, its tip pointing at Hyun, its spin gone, its weight somehow no longer a weight. It sat in the open air of the room, as though the space around it had simply decided to hold it. The tip of the blade was a single millimeter from Hyun's fingers. The gap was so small that from any camera angle in the room, it looked like he was touching it. He was not. There was a distance there, barely a distance. The kind that barely exists, the kind that only had meaning because it was the difference between contact and not. Hyun's hand was perfectly still. His face was perfectly still. His pulse, had anyone been monitoring it, was 64 beats per minute. The room did not breathe. Cress had not moved from the position of the throw. His eyes, which were wide to begin with, had gone wider. Not in aggression now, but in something that the Veldrath Dominion did not have a common word for, because they had not needed one in a very long time. Surprise. Real surprise. The kind that doesn't have a response ready, because the response library had never included this situation. One of his aides made a sound in Veldrath. The translator caught it this time. "What is that?" Nobody answered. Jay straightened his papers on the broken table. He did not look at the blade hanging in the air. He looked at Cress. "Shall we continue?" he said. Same words as before, same tone, as if nothing unusual had happened. As if the blade was not floating 3 centimeters from his security officer's fingertips. 3 decks above the negotiation chamber, in a small monitoring room with 6 screens and poor ventilation, a woman named Ara sat in front of a console and watched the feed from the chamber camera. She had been there for 4 hours. She had not moved from her chair. She had not spoken to the 2 technicians beside her for the last 20 minutes. She watched the blade stop. She looked at the readout numbers running along the side of her screen. She exhaled. "It works," she said quietly. One of the technicians looked at her. He started to say something. She raised one hand and stopped him without looking away from the screen. She was watching Hyun's face, watching Cress, watching the blade. 30 years, she thought. 30 years of work. 12 teams, 4 failed trials, 2 accidents, 1 death that she still thought about in the quiet hours before sleep. Every senior official who had told her the project was too ambitious, too expensive, too strange, too human. Every budget cut, every review board, every meeting where she had sat across from men who did not believe her and had to make them believe her anyway. 30 years, and a single millimeter. She reached forward and pressed the record confirmation on her console with one finger. "Mark the time," she said. "Mark everything." He tried to seize the blade mid-air. It stopped a millimeter from his fingers. Part 3. A millimeter from his fingers. Time did not move in the room. That was how it felt. Like the air itself had stopped, along with the blade. Every person in the negotiation chamber was frozen in some version of the same moment, all of them processing what they were seeing, and none of them finding a clean answer. The blade hung in the open air of the chamber, like it had always been there, like gravity had simply forgotten about it, like the laws that governed how objects moved through space had quietly decided to take a break. Hyun's hand was still extended. His fingers were still open. His face had not changed. Cress had not moved. It was Cress's lead A who broke first. He took a single step forward from behind his superior and stared at the blade, then at Hyun, then at the blade again. His translator chip clicked on and he spoke, and the room system caught it. "How is this done?" Nobody answered him. Jay was still seated. He had folded his hands on the surface of the broken table and was looking at Cress with the same measured expression he had worn since the start of the meeting. He was not smiling. He was not gloating. He looked like a man who was waiting for a conversation to resume. Hyun lowered his hand. As he did, the blade dropped. It did not clatter dramatically. It fell cleanly and landed flat on the floor, between him and the center of the room, with a single metallic sound that rang out and then faded. Hyun looked at it for a moment. Then he looked back up at the wall, hands behind his back, as if he had simply caught a pen someone had tossed across a desk. The silence after the blade hit the floor was different from the silence before. Before, it had been the silence of shock. After, it was the silence of recalibration, the sound of a dozen minds, human and alien both, trying to place what had just happened into a category that made sense. Cress stepped back. It was a small step, barely noticeable, but it was there. For a being whose species had not taken a step back in 4,000 years of recorded negotiation history, it was significant. His aide noticed it. So did Jay. So did Hyun, though he gave no sign. Cress spoke. His voice had changed. Not weak, but different. Slower. More careful. What did your soldier just do? Jay looked at him. He made a judgment call, he said. You threw a weapon at a member of my team. He handled it. I would like to return to the matter of the joint administration proposal, if you don't mind. That is not a natural ability, Cress said. His eyes were still fixed on Hyun. No, Jay agreed. It is not. He offered nothing more. The old calculation was running again behind his eyes. Hyun could see it, even from across the room. The Veldrath envoy was trying to work out what had happened. Whether it was a device, whether it was a field of some kind, whether it was a trap set for this specific moment, whether there were more people in the room with the same ability, whether the ability worked at longer range, whether it could stop larger objects. Every answer led to a worse question. That was the point. Hyun understood that too, even though no one had said it to him directly. He had been given a file 6 months ago, a sealed file, handed to him by a senior officer who had watched him read it and then taken it back without a word. The file had explained what the implant was, what it did, and what its purpose was in a situation like this one. Not to stop blades, not really. The blade was secondary. The point was the question that followed the blade. That question, what did your soldier just do, was worth more in a negotiation room than any counteroffer on any piece of paper. Because it put Cress in a position the Veldrath Dominion had never been in before. They did not know what they were dealing with. 4,000 years of expansion had taught the Dominion one very clean lesson. Know your opponent's limits before you act. Map the edges of what they can do, and then push just past those edges. It was a reliable method. It had worked on 17 civilizations. It worked because most civilizations had comprehensible limits. Limits that could be learned from a distance, through observation and intelligence gathering, and the occasional controlled test. The Veldrath had been watching humanity for 60 years. The file said, limited, faster-than-light capability, no offensive fleet to match Dominion strength, developing weapons technology, no confirmed exotic physical abilities. The file was now wrong, and Cress knew it. And he knew that he did not know how wrong it was, or in how many other places it might be wrong. That was the specific kind of uncertainty that the Veldrath Dominion had never had to deal with. Not incomplete data, but data that had been quietly, deliberately incorrect for reasons Cress could not yet determine. He picked up his blade from the floor. One of his aides had started to move toward it, but Cress reached it first, bending slowly and lifting it with a careful deliberateness that looked nothing like the easy confidence he had carried it with before. He sheathed it. Jay waited. Cress looked at him for a long time. Then he sat back down. "Continue," he said. 3 decks up, Ara had not moved from her console. The 2 technicians in the room with her had stopped pretending to work and were both watching the feeds from the chamber. One of them, a young man named Teho, on his 3rd month with the project, had his mouth slightly open. The other, an older woman named Bora, was watching the numbers on Ara's secondary screen with an expression of quiet amazement. The suppression field held at full resolution, Bora said, not quite a question. Yes, Ara said. Through the shielding in the chamber walls, yes, and the range was 21 meters from the implant to the blade at the point of full stop. We designed for 25. Ara finally leaned back in her chair, slowly, like someone who had been holding a position for a very long time and was only now allowing themselves to relax. We had margin. How long did it take the field to respond from the moment the blade was released? 0.3 seconds, Ara said. Full kinetic suppression from detection to stop in under half a second. Tejo looked at the screen. They'll never trust a negotiation room again. Not with us. That's not the goal, Ara said. She was looking at the feed, at Cress, at Jay, at Hyun standing quiet at the door. The goal is that they sit down and talk properly. They threw everything at this conversation that they throw at every conversation. The size, the history, the blade. She paused, and it didn't work. That's the point. Not fear, just not working. Bora looked at her. What happens when they find out how many soldiers we've implanted? Ara was quiet for a moment. They'll ask that question first, and then they'll ask the second question. Which is, how many other things have we been building that their file doesn't mention? The room was quiet. On the screen below, Jay was speaking again, laying out the joint administration terms with the same calm, unhurried voice. Cress was listening. His aides were sitting. The blade was in its sheath and had not come out again. Ara watched and said nothing more. The answer to Bora's question was not something she was going to say out loud, in a room with open air vents, a standard security sweep schedule, and 2 technicians who, good as they were, did not yet have the clearance for it. The answer was more than enough, and they had been building for a long time. He tried to seize the blade mid-air. It stopped a millimeter from his fingers. Part 4. What humans had been doing in the quiet. 6 months before the blade was thrown, in a building that had no name on its exterior and no listing in any public directory, a meeting took place. The building was in a quiet part of a city that most people passed through without stopping. It looked like a research annex, the kind of place that filed papers, ran data, and did nothing interesting. The parking area was half empty most days. The lights in the upper floors stayed on late, but late lights in a research building were not unusual. Nobody paid attention. That was by design. Inside on the 4th floor, in a room with no windows, a man named Do-hyun sat at the head of a long table. Do-hyun was 61 years old. He had spent 34 years in military service before retiring. In those 34 years, he had commanded 3 deep space postings, overseen the construction of 2 station defense networks, and sat on the board that approved or rejected every major military research project submitted for funding over a 12-year period. He had seen a great many projects. He had funded very few of them. He had killed most of them, not because they were bad ideas, but because they were ideas that announced themselves. Big, loud proposals that wanted credit and attention and press releases. Do-hyun had no use for any of those things. Ara had come to him 14 years ago with a folder, a cup of tea she had not touched, and one sentence. I can build something that will stop a weapon in midair, using only the neural signal of a trained human soldier. He had looked at her for a long time. She had looked back at him without flinching. He had asked her how long it would take. She had said, long. He had asked her how much it would cost. She had said, more than she would tell him up front, and less than the alternative. He had asked her what the alternative was. She had said, continuing to negotiate with species that respected strength above everything else, while having no physical demonstration of strength that they could not already calculate and account for. He had thought about that for 3 days. Then he had called her back and told her she had the funding and the access she needed, and one rule. We do not reveal this program, he had told her. Not to the press, not to allied governments, not to treaty partners. Not in demonstrations, not in procurement documents, not in budget overviews. If you need to hide costs inside other line items, I will tell you which ones. If you need facilities that are not on any map, I will arrange them. This program does not exist until the moment it needs to exist. Ara had agreed without hesitation, which told him she had already thought of this herself. That was 14 years ago. Now Daihun sat at the table in the windowless room with Ara on his left and a man named Quan on his right. Quan was the current head of Deep Space Intelligence, compact, quiet, with a specific kind of patience that came from spending a career listening carefully to things other people said carelessly. He had a file folder in front of him. He had not opened it yet. The Veldrath have requested a negotiation, Daihun said. It was not a question. Everyone in the room already knew. They submitted the request through standard Galactic Council channels 2 weeks ago, Quan said. Formal, clean. They want the disputed zone, and they want it quickly. The request language was polite, but the deadline attached to it was not. 60 days from acceptance to withdrawal of all human assets. What happens at 61 days by their terms? Ara asked. They did not specify, Quan said, which is itself a specification. Ara nodded. Do-hyun looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Ara. Is the program ready? The implant technology has been stable for 8 months, she said. We have 212 active implant carriers, all voluntary, all fully trained. Suppression range varies by individual neural output, but our strongest performers can manage kinetic stops up to 25 meters with objects up to 15 kilograms. Accuracy at that range is above 92%. Response time from threat detection to full stop averages 0.32 seconds. 212 soldiers. Yes. And the Veldrath file on human military capability lists 0 exotic physical or kinetic abilities, Ara said. Their intelligence is good. It just has a gap in it that we have been very careful to maintain. Do-hyun said nothing for a moment. He looked at the folder in front of Quan, which was still closed. What does the Veldrath expect from this negotiation? He asked. Quan opened the folder. He turned a page. Based on their behavioral pattern in every prior negotiation with a non-Dominion species, intimidation, escalation, and a controlled display of force at some point in the proceedings, designed to close the conversation on their terms. They have done this in 12 of the last 13 border negotiations. In the one exception, the other party arrived with a fleet that outmatched theirs. They negotiated in good faith that day. We don't have a fleet that outmatches theirs, Do-hyun said. No, Quan agreed. We have something they don't have a category for. Do-hyun looked at Ara. Who do you want in the room? He asked. Hyun, she said, without hesitating. He's our best performer. Highest response accuracy, longest range, fastest neural engagement. He's also trained in security liaison work, so his presence in the room won't look unusual. He should be assigned as the chamber security officer for the negotiation. And the negotiator? Jay, said Quan. He's worked 3 Veldrath-adjacent postings. He understands how they move in a room, and he does not rattle. Do-hyun nodded slowly. Brief them both. Full program disclosure for Hyun. He needs to know what he is and what he's doing. Jay gets operational knowledge only. He needs to know something may happen, and that he should not react to it. He does not need to know the details. Understood, Ara said. One more rule, Do-hyun said. He looked at both of them. If the Veldrath do not escalate, if the negotiation is clean and they agree to terms without a display of force, we do nothing. Hyun keeps his hands at his sides. The program stays hidden. We only show what we have if they force us to show it. He looked at the folder, then at the wall. "We do not show our hand for no reason," he said. "We do not show it to impress. We do not show it for leverage. We show it only if they make it necessary. That is the rule. That has always been the rule." It was a rule that came from his understanding of one basic truth, that the most powerful position in any conflict was not the one where the other side could see everything you had. It was the one where they could see that there was something, but could not see how much. The moment you showed everything, they knew your limits. As long as they did not know your limits, the question of what you were capable of would eat at them constantly. The Veldroth had made it necessary. They had forced the hand, so the hand had opened. And now, 6 months later, in the monitoring room 3 decks above the negotiation chamber, Aura sat and watched the result. Kress had thrown his blade. Hune had stopped it, and the Veldroth Dominion, 4,000 years old, 17 civilizations absorbed, unbeaten in 12 consecutive negotiations, was sitting back down at a broken table and listening to a human diplomat explain joint administration terms. The program had not been built for this moment specifically. It had been built for every moment like this one, whenever they came, wherever they came, for however long humanity needed it. Dohyun's rule had been simple. Be ready before you need to be. Don't tell anyone you're ready. And when the moment comes, don't make a speech about it. Just stop the blade. Let that do the talking. He tried to seize the blade mid-air. It stopped a millimeter from his fingers. Part 5. The answer no one wanted. The negotiation did not end that afternoon. It ran through the evening and into the following morning. 11 more hours of careful, exhausting, word-by-word conversation between Jay and Kress, with translators running and aides taking notes, and 2 people on opposite sides of a broken table, working through terms that neither side had fully expected to be discussing in this way. Kress did not touch his blade again. He did not raise his voice above a measured level. He did not stand up from his seat. He did not make references to what the Dominion had done to other species. He negotiated, properly, seriously, the way the Veldrath apparently could when they decided that the room they were in was one that required it. Jay met him there. He gave on small things and held on large ones. He moved the joint extraction split from 60-40 to 55-45. He agreed to a longer timeline on outpost reorganization. He gave up 2 of the 3 Veldrath corridor navigation demands in exchange for the Dominion formally acknowledging the existing human outposts as established infrastructure, rather than contested claims. It was not everything humanity had come for. It was more than anyone outside the room had expected humanity to leave with. By the time the final document was drafted, it was early morning station time. The lights in the corridor outside the chamber had shifted to their lower overnight setting. Most of the monitoring staff had rotated out. Ara was still at her console. Kress signed the accord. He pressed his mark to the document slowly, with the care of someone who was still thinking about something else while they did it. His lead aide signed beneath him. Jay signed opposite, his own mark clean and quick. 2 of Jay's junior aides countersigned as witnesses. The translator program logged the completion and sent the timestamp to the Galactic Council Observer Network. It was done. Kress stood, Jay stood. They did not shake hands. That was not a Veldrath custom. But Kress looked at Jay for a long moment before he turned toward the door. He did not say anything immediately. Then, at the threshold, he stopped. He looked across the chamber at Hyun, who had been standing at his post near the opposite door for the entire 11 hours without being relieved. Hyun looked back at him. Kress studied him. He studied his face, his hands, his posture, looking for something he could name. Then Kress turned and left. His aides followed. Their footsteps moved down the corridor and faded. Jay sat back down in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He let out a long breath. Then he looked at Hyun. Good work, he said. You too. Jay almost smiled. Almost. The docking bay of Ironhold was large and poorly lit at that hour. Cress's ship was being prepared for departure, supply lines disconnecting, clearance checks running through the bay control system, crew moving at the edges of the wide space. Cress stood near the ship's main ramp. One of his senior aides, a veteran of more than 30 years of Dominion service, a Veldrath named Uresh, who had been with Cress longer than any other member of his staff, stood beside him. Hyun was there. He had been assigned to escort the Veldrath delegation to the docking bay as part of standard security protocol. He stood a few meters back, hands at his sides, waiting for them to board so he could close out the security log. Uresh spoke to Cress in low Veldrath. The bay's translator system caught most of it, though the feed was not being actively monitored at that hour. "How long," Uresh said, "do you think they have been ready?" Cress did not answer immediately. He was looking at the hull of his own ship, the familiar dark plating, the Dominion markings along the underside of the forward section, the scale and weight of a vessel that had moved through space for 30 years without anything standing in its way. "Long," he said finally. "The data chip that the diplomat placed on the table," Uresh said. "I reviewed it during the night. The footage on it. The events are spread over 9 years. 14 separate incidents across 4 different star systems." "I know," Cress said. "That means they were ready before they knew we would come, before this negotiation was even requested." "I know." Uresh was quiet for a moment. He had a careful mind, one of the reasons Cress kept him close. He thought before he spoke, and when he spoke, he said what he actually meant. "We have been watching them for 60 years, Uresh said. "Our file is thorough." "Our file is wrong," Cress said. "It is incomplete." "That is not a comfortable difference." Uresh looked across the bay at Hyun, who was standing still and looking at nothing in particular. "How many of them have what that one has?" Cress did not answer. The question was too large for an honest answer, and they both understood that. It was not a question with a clean number attached to it. It was a question with a chain behind it, because if the answer was 200, the next question was whether there were 2,000. And if the answer to that was yes, the question behind that one was what else had they built that was not in the file. And behind that question were more questions, each one darker and more uncomfortable than the last. The Veldrath Dominion had survived 4,000 years by knowing the answer before they walked into a room. They did not know the answer anymore. Cress turned to board the ship. At the base of the ramp he paused. He looked back across the bay, one more time, at Hyun. He almost asked. He understood that asking would give him nothing. The human would say nothing useful, either because he was trained not to, or because whatever he said could not be trusted, or because the answer was something that could not be held in a question-and-answer exchange in a docking bay at early morning station time. Instead, Cress said to no one in particular, in a voice low enough that the bay translator might or might not have caught it, "How long have they been ready?" Hyun heard it. He was close enough. The bay was quiet enough. He did not look at Cress. He looked straight ahead at the wall of the bay, hands at his sides, waiting for the delegation to board. When the ramp sealed behind the last of the aides, and the ship's exterior lights shifted from ground to pre-departure status, Hyun turned and walked back toward the interior of the station. His steps were even. He did not hurry. He passed through the bay door into the main corridor and continued toward the security station to close out his log. Above, 3 decks up, Ara was shutting down her console. She moved through a system save sequence, locked the program files, and stood up from the chair she had been in for most of the last 20 hours. Her back hurt. She was tired in the specific way that came from a very long time of sustained attention, the kind of tired that sleep would fix, but not immediately. Aura was still at the secondary console, finalizing the data record. Tejo had gone off shift 2 hours earlier. "It's done," Bora said. "Not a question." "Yes," Ara said. "What happens now?" Ara picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. She looked at the screens, which were all in standby mode now, dark blue, no feeds, no readouts, just the quiet hum of hardware doing nothing active. "We write the report," she said. "We review the performance data. We look at what worked and what needs adjustment. We brief Toyun." She paused. "And then we go back to work." "On improvements?" Bora asked. "On the next thing," Ara said. She said it the same way she said most things, plainly, without emphasis, without drama. It was just a fact. The Shin protocol had worked. That was good. That was, in the accounting of 30 years, a satisfying result. But it was not the end of anything. The galaxy was large. The Veldrath were not the only old power in it. There were others who had files on humanity. Others who had drawn conclusions about what humans could and could not do. Others who made decisions based on those conclusions without checking the file again. Every file had gaps. Every gap was a question that hadn't been asked yet. And in quiet buildings, in windowless rooms, in monitoring stations 3 decks above, places where the real conversations happened, humans had been asking questions long before anyone else knew they were asking them. That was not a secret weapon or a grand strategy. That was just what happened when you were a young species in a very old galaxy, and you paid attention. Ara turned off the last light in the room and walked out into the corridor. The station hummed around her, the sound of Ironhold going about its business, steady and constant and unimpressed with itself, the same way it always had been. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lower deck. She had a report to write, and after that, work to do.